The American Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991, in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D-151, tape number 37.
Director of the Post-Adoption Center of the Southwest in San Antonio, Texas. It is a community service that is sponsored by Texas Cradle Society of San Antonio, Texas. And if any of you are familiar with Texas Cradle Society, then I won't tell you about our colorful history then. Usually at the AAC conferences, they're always glad, I use that with quotes around it, to see me. And I've been coming to AAC meetings since about '81, I guess. And I've been with Texas Cradle for about 3 years when we set up the Post-Adoption Center. And I was with Methodist Mission in San Antonio prior to that time. And in coming to AAC meetings over the years, not have I learned a lot, but I sometimes go away reminding myself that I don't listen to all the triad members nearly enough until I got into Post-Adopt, and now that I'm in Post-Adopt, I very definitely do. We are a nonprofit agency, and what I would like to do today is to share with you some of the things that we have learned through the years, and most of you, or many of you perhaps, are therapists and working in the field and are well aware of all the research. I think that Lois Molina's annotated bibliography is a real good place to start. And if you are a therapist, I certainly would recommend that you get a copy of that, although in talking with her yesterday, she said that it's already outdated, so, because there is so much research going on. And those of you in the triad, I'm sure, feel like statistics, maybe even go so far as say guinea pigs. There is just so much research going on. You sometimes wonder, just, hey, we're human beings, and we're all individuals. But we have drawn over the years some conclusions, some correlations, and the annotated bibliography gives you a good basis for that. That is in our bibliography that we will send out to you in the packet. So if you want that, we'll be glad to give it to you. Just before I came up here, I was at my brother's in San Diego, who's retired and plays with his computer all the time. He said, he really doesn't know what I do. And he said, oh, let's pull up adoption on the computer. He has Prodigy. And he pulled it up, and it gave us a little bit about what adoption and post-adoption is all about. And I just blasted it. I said, none of this is true. These statements aren't even correlated in any way. And he kind of chalked it off to the fact that this is the typical kid's sister who's still rebelling. But if you would like to see it, it is very interesting because it says, in Great Britain, a 1975 act gave adopted children over the age of 18 access to their birth records. In the years immediately following the act's passage, only about 2% of the British adoptees used it, but the number of children offered for adoption decreased by almost 50%. Those two statements aren't even, related in any way. But that's what happens when you have a subject such as this, and the media gets a hold of it, and of course they pick out the sensationalistic. They take the two polar extremes instead of the middle. So what I'd like to share with you today, just because of my longevity in the field, some of the middle ground that I have experienced. Now I certainly don't have all the answers to the questions, as I'm sure you haven't either. I was listening to a psychologist this morning on TV, and it's wonderful here in California because everybody loves counseling and therapy. In Texas, they're not quite so sure. You have to be sick to like counseling and therapy. But I was listening to a psychologist, and she had an answer to everything. It was just absolutely fascinating, and I thought, what chutzpah? Boy, I'd love to be in her shoes and have all the answers. But I've been in the field since the 1950s, and I can tell you I certainly don't have all the answers by any means. Since I've been in Post-Adopt for about the last 6 years, I am learning a tremendous amount from the clients, from the triad. defiance. Do you dislike that word too? From the members of the triad. And I learn every day something new comes up that I learn from. And I think those of us that are in the field, whether we're members of the triad ourselves, realize that it's not a static thing. It's constantly ongoing, just as adoption is. And I guess that's true with any profession. You know, you ask a banker how things were yesterday and then how things are today, and he's going to tell you there's been a tremendous amount of change. Those of us that are in the profession, if we stick our heads in the sand and say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, you're not staying on top of your profession. All right, the Post-Adoption Center of the Southwest, like I say, is a community service. We're similar to Hope Cottage in Dallas and DePelchin in Houston, not to leave out some of the other good post-adopt services in the state. But those are pretty much the triad of post-adopt services as far as Texas is concerned. And what we have found is that in our counseling of all the members of the triad, that if you can do education prior to the adoption, you certainly can put yourself out of business real soon, and that would be great. Because those of us that are in post-adopt would like to put ourselves out of business. Unfortunately, the reality is that instead of applying what we have learned over the decades in the past, and in spite of all the literature that has come out, there are still many adoptions that are being done still in the dark ages. When I started out in the 50s, and I won't even tell you the agency because, no I will, Crittenden in Illinois. Okay, see, that's why I really ought to say. My first master's was in psych, and all I did was just psychological testing. There were so many birth mothers. There weren't birth fathers in those days, just birth mothers. Birth mothers there that I spent my full time doing psychological testing. And I think that's also how Stanley versus Illinois came up as the Supreme Court case that there are birth fathers then after that, and looked into that, and it serves us right. But I didn't get in on the social work because my master's of being in psych. But I kind of started getting uneasy with it a little bit. But then I went off like most people and fell in love and got married and raised 5 kids and 10 grandchildren and so on and so forth. But at that point with Crittenden, there were so many babies to be placed that you did all kinds of things to help the adoptive parents decide that that's what they wanted to do, because there were so few prospective adoptive parents and many more babies. Play the game, you know, that this baby, whoo, I had a baby, and tell the birth mothers, of course, the old statement of build your life and go on anew. Everything that you've heard out of the dark ages that happened in adoption. And now it was the flip side of the coin that we had 20 years later. And I started with Catholic Charities in Houston. And things were getting a little bit different in those days. And we began to realize there was a lot more to this. It wasn't just a matter of placing a baby and pretending like the baby was yours. So there were some changes that started about that time. When I got to Methodist Mission in San Antonio, there was a tremendous change in attitude. And I believe that we were doing post-adopt work and openness in a very, not underground. We just weren't telling, pilot study. We were doing a lot of pilot studies in those days. Until we decided when AAC came to San Antonio in 81, was anybody there? 81? That, wow, some big changes needed to be made. And that's when post-adopt really took hold. Now, if you read the Federal Register, you'll know that the federal government is very much into post-adoption. But it's primarily, of course, for the special needs children. They do not accept the fact that anyone who is adopted may be a special needs case and could use some post-adopt services. When we talk about special needs, we're not talking about pathology. We're talking about dynamics. And in fact, in post-adopt, We really don't get into deep therapy and pathology. We deal primarily with the dynamics. What we would like to see in order to do away with post-adopt in the future is to put it on an educational basis, because there are far too many people who object to counseling at a later time, because counseling does connotate pathology to them. I was listening to one birth mother group who had had their reunions and listening to similarities in their stories of what was happening post-reunion. And these are exactly the things that we try to prepare people for in counseling at post-adoption centers, so that they will know that these dynamics do enter into it and don't have to wait until it happens later and then get together with others and say, oh, that happened to you also. Now, it may not happen to them, but you can have a fire drill to prevent a fire. And that's what the counseling is. And I guess it's probably not fully counseling, it's education. Just giving the people we work with the benefit of what we know as professionals in the field. If you're familiar with the Texas Registry Act, that I brought a brochure with me on that it does require a minimum of 1 hour of counseling before you can get into the registry, and a lot of people take offense to that. They say, I'm perfectly all right. Who in the hell needs to tell me I need counseling before I can go into the registry? And if you know our Texas registry, it's one of those if, ands, and buts registry that has a lot of obstacles to overcome. But I fully believe that the requirement of the hour of counseling is not one of the obstacles. And I would hope that we could get the word out that preparational counseling for matches and reunions isn't to pass judgment on you to see whether or not you're in good mental health in order to have one, but just to help you understand what might happen and to prepare you. The same thing happens with the adoptive parents. We want to prepare the prospective adoptive parents for what might happen in adoption. It may not, but we know that there certainly are dynamics in adoption that you can look for. And if you're familiar with them, then you can take action on them. We use David Brzezinski, Dr. Brzezinski's work from Rutgers University. I don't know whether you're familiar with his work or not, but he puts a great deal of stress on the latency age child. And our center does workshops where we get the latency age child in, and they work with my counterpart, who is a Pied Piper with children. Her name's Vicki. And she works with the children while I work with the parents. And it's somewhat like talking sex with your child at that age. First of all, they wait until you're in the car on the freeway and pop the question to you as a captive audience, and then you go, that's over with. And like sex, it isn't a one-time telling. It's an ongoing, lifelong process that you deal with according to the developmental stages of the child. And we use Erickson's mode. Piaget isn't too far off from that, but we do use Erickson's as to what the developmental stages of the child and what they can accept. Now, that's what we do with the prospective adoptive parents in preparation. And in fact, Linda Burgess, I don't know whether you heard her presentation while she's here. She's kind of a grande dame of adoption. Wrote The Art of Adoption and Adoption How It Works. Is that correct? And when I first met her at AAC years back, professionals were not encouraged to come to AAC. You had to be a member of the triad. So we'd kind of sit in the back of the room and listen and learn, and whoa, if we spoke up and said something. In fact, I started to one time, and Linda gave me an elbow in the ribs and reminded me that we were there just to listen and to learn. And I said, okay, that's fine. So it's just been the last few years that AAC has encouraged the professionals to come also. And of course, many of the professionals are members of the triad also, and there is a variance of opinion on the feeling of that. And we have learned, and we have listened, And I think that we have moved much faster in the field because of these people. There's just no doubt about it. In Texas, we've moved faster also because there's competition. Texas, unfortunately, has very lax laws. That won't get back to Jean, will it, our licensing agent? But very lax laws so that adoption is not all that impossible. But what we would hope is that we prepare everyone in order to make this a better climate in mental health for everyone that's involved in adoption. What we need to do is take away the adversarial approach between the birth parents and the adoptive parents for the adoptee's sake. Now, granted, we agree completely that if a birth parent certainly should be encouraged to parent their own child and look into every effort possible to either have the birth parent or someone in the family parent this child. But all too often, the birth mother is the one who does not want someone in the family to parent the child, and you have to take that into consideration. I'm not in maternity or placement anymore. I'm strictly in post-adopt, and I keep going over to my office is in a carriage house behind Texas Cradle, and I keep going over to Texas Cradle and say, now from a post-adopt perspective, folks, and they hate to see me coming sometimes because I keep saying from a post-adopt perspective, but they're very progressive and wise women, so they listen. If you do listen to your clients, then you know what direction to take. And sometimes it doesn't seem wise to take the middle road. Sometimes you have to be confrontational, compassionately. And one of the instances on that is that since it is a lifelong process for not only the adoptee, who is thought in terms of as a pregnancy to begin with, and how often, if you have adult adoptee groups, how often have you heard them say, I'm not an it, I'm not a pregnancy, I wasn't a problem, I wasn't a mistake. Those are all terms that you often hear an adoptee say in a group. This is not how the birth mother looks at it either, except she's under a lot of stress and trauma at the time, and if she doesn't get true decision-making counseling without adoption being pushed upon her, she will get past the idea that it is a pregnancy. I feel that birth parents have a very definite responsibility beyond the birth of the child, because I've had too many situations in later years in dealing with the birth mothers in the 60s and 70s age group who still talk to me in terms of let sleeping dogs lie, reputations, complete denial. And I understand that because it's been a very traumatic experience for them. But they do owe more than birth to that adoptee. And that needs to be put across in the counseling with the birth parents. Of course, today when you have open adoption, that takes care of the situation. And that's why I've been a proponent of open adoption since I got into post-adopt, is because it's going to do away with a lot of these problems that we do have. As far as open records are concerned, I am a proponent of open records, but I also know with the birth parents of the years past that there has to be some exclusionary rule that allows the judge to decide whose rights come first. Jean Payton and I go round and round about this, and I said when I first started in post-adopt, at least 80% of the birth mothers were just waiting for the telephone call. Jean would tell me, Joanne, it would be 99% if you'd let the adoptees make their own calls. It's the resistance and the anger that they have towards the agencies. However, I have found that many of the birth mothers will use terms such as that and say, for heaven's sakes, please convince them that they just cannot come into my life at this time. Hopefully with time this changes. But some of these situations that happened back in those years are very definitely so traumatic, the denial is so great, that they feel that having just given birth to the child and have given life is all that they needed to do, and that was it. So I feel that the birth parents, birth fathers too, and I don't need to exclude them at all, don't mean to, except they have what we call delayed reaction syndrome in many cases. I see birth fathers years later, when they settle down and start having a family of their own, start thinking about that child that they have out there somewhere, and the guilt really sets in and they come in very frantic to do something. I am not a search consultant. I'm a mental health professional, and I try to help them deal with the way things were and the way things are and where do they go from here. So if you prepare the birth parents and prior to any reunion so that they will know that what we heard yesterday in the birth mother group, my need was tremendous, it was overwhelming, and I frightened off the adoptee. You know that if you can tell them about this, and if you can tell the adoptee about this, this is something that they see as a dynamic and not something personal. It's like a death or loss or separation. Why was I given away as a child, quote unquote? Was I not pretty? Was I not a good enough baby? Was I fussy? Those are things, they're irrelevant, right? It had nothing to do with that, and yet that's how the child sees it. If a child loses a parent due to death, they think that was because they said something wrong. And we know that it certainly cannot be so. But it's very difficult to explain this to the children unless you take into consideration their developmental stage and give it to them in terms that they can understand. And then when they go into the next stage, elaborate a little bit more so that they know what has happened in that stage. And that's why we use the Erickson's mode of how to explain this to children. The birth parents need to know that. The birth parents need to know what are these dynamics. Their great fear, of course, is the child has died and no one has told them. The child has remained in the foster care system and no one has told them. The child has severe problems and no one has told them. It's a two-way street. If you have, I suppose you can look at adoption as an aberration. I prefer to see it as a variation on the theme, somewhat like blended families or some other way of forming a family. And if you get the two sets of parents together to work in concert for this individual, not this pregnancy, but a child who becomes an adult, and you get them to work in concert, and it's not necessarily even contact, it's just a matter of being there and being available. I will have birth parents come in and say, I don't necessarily want to be in touch, but I just want to be available so that they will know, the adoptive parents, if the child has a question, that I'm here and I would be glad to have contact with them and let them know what is happening. So if you have the adversarial approach broken down so that they work in concert for the adoptee, that validates the adoptee as a person. If you've seen Two Peas in a Pod's production of The Right to Know, have you seen that video yet? Excellent video, and we show it to everyone that comes into our center. We are a resource center, and we have many, many books, many videos to share with anyone that does come in. It's an excellent video for everybody to see. Two Peas in a Pod, yeah, Right to Know. If you can get them to see that everybody has to cooperate on this, if there is going to be an adoption, and we can't very well say there's not going to be any more adoption in the world, this perhaps will make it better. And we have criticism from people saying, yes, but it worked fine in the past. And those of us who know the stats know that it didn't necessarily work fine in the past. But what we're doing is we're actually going back to the way adoption was. Adoption still in many countries is very open, and when a child needs a home other than from the birth parents, the child is taken into the home and everybody knows where that child is and who those child's parents are, right? And that's the way it used to be here also until we became so secretive. And I think that that happened because we did have such an influx of so many children being placed for adoption, primarily after WW2. And that's when secrecy really got a stranglehold on the profession. So we're not really doing anything new. We're just going back to the way it was. And we have this in older child adoptions. They know who their parents are. They may be limited as to what kind of contact they have with them, but that happens in blended families also, or families that are geographically separated from each other. And you have it in your family. You have a favorite aunt, I'm sure, someplace that you would dearly love to be with more often, but it just isn't logistically possible to do it. The secretiveness that went on for the birth mother was, I think that was the thing that just shook me up the most. To get a call from a birth mother 20 years later, 30 years later, and ask, is my baby still alive? How could you say that was a good method if someone all those years had thought that? And then you look up an old file and dust it off, and you find out that the baby died of SIDS, you know, and then she has this double loss of not only releasing the child, but having to deal with the loss again. That happens. We have the adoptees go through the same thing. They wait until their parents are deceased, their adoptive parents, before they go ahead and search. Their birth parents are deceased. These are all things that don't need to be and shouldn't be as far as what's in the best mental health interests of people. Hopefully, open adoption will take care of that. Hopefully, open records will take care of that. But I do believe, as I said before, that there still is an element of the closed records of the past that we need to allow the birth parents who do not wish to participate to somehow let us know, and then it needs to go into the courts to see whose rights supersede. Because your adult adoptee groups think they have the right, no matter how the birth parent feels, and the birth parent has some strong feelings too. Fortunately, that isn't a large segment. We have the support groups, like I say, of the birth parents of the adult adoptees and birth parents of minor adoptees, and the dynamics in those two are a great deal different, but some similarities as far as loss. In adoption, everybody has loss. Your prospective adoptive parents have loss, your birth parents, and your adoptee. Everybody has loss, and you're dealing with that. We have an adopted parent group of adult adoptees, and that's one of the most interesting groups that we have. These are the adoptive parents who have been very supportive of their adult children in searching, and cognitively they've been very, oh, I want you to do this. Sometimes they'll even cry when you call them on the phone and say, this is the happiest day of my life. But then once the relationship starts into effect, their head tells them one thing and their heart tells them something else. And when I get that group together, they'll say, well, you know, I was very, very glad to share my daughter with her birth mother, or she would even refer to them as our daughter. But I don't know about those grandchildren. I don't know that I can share those at all. Now, some therapists would say on a Freudian scale that has something to do with infertility. But we also see this in adoptive parents who have birth children and adopted children. They become somewhat possessive, and this is a pretty good reason why they become possessive. They first deal with infertility or whatever it is, and then they have to jump through hoops and stack babies in order to prove that they can be good parents before they have a child placed with them. They have to prove so much that then they have to become super parents. And then the children have to become super parents. And then we have the classic thing of the good adoptee, bad adoptee. And you have the good adoptee who is the overachiever, doesn't want to make waves, doesn't want anybody to be unhappy. And then you have the bad adoptee who rebels, and the good adoptee has to be even better to overcome the heartache that the bad adoptee gives. And we see a lot of that classic dichotomy in the dynamics on something such as that. Sure.
Do you see that often in adoptive families where there are several children, 2 or more children have been adopted, where one is the good adoptee and one is a bad adoptee? Or is it not?
Yes, primarily. However, we also see it in what we call the blended adoptive family, where there are the birth children and the adopted children. And often the adopted child becomes such a perfectionist and so wanting to please that the birth child will purposely push the boundaries to go the other way. And I'll have children that will come into the office and the birth child will say, you know, I sure wish I were adopted. You know, it'd be a lot easier in this family if I'd been adopted also. So we can see those dynamics not only in the two children adopted family, but we can see it in other ways. Variation on the theme again.
I'm an adopted mom, and last summer I went to Denver, Colorado to meet with our birth father of my oldest son, and they didn't know I was coming. I have relatives there, so I just called them up on the phone and said, guess who's coming to dinner thing. And they were very receptive, and I was mainly after a health history. And they invited me out to the house. Their son was in Saudi Arabia on the front lines. He'd been there since the beginning of August. And and at first I think this, I'd only heard the birth mother's story, so I only knew one side of the story, and then I got the other side of the story. And at first they would kind of deny that this might be their child.
Yeah.
But anyway, they let us come out and visit, and gave us pictures and everything. And when I left, I had that possessiveness.
The possession.
I felt like I left part of my little boy there.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I felt like, I know I needed to do that for Spencer because I want him to have a very rounded idea of where he came from and know everything. There's no secrets. We have very open adoptions.
Mm-hmm.
But this was going to be a secret unless I went and did this for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. I really felt like I left a piece of him there, and I thought that's kind of a weird feeling.
No, I've heard that before. And I think there are times when you have to take the bull by the horns on some of these things. However, adoptive parents do have to be very careful that they do not develop the relationship first and strongly with the birth parents. And we've seen that happen also, and leaving the adoptee out. Although, once again, like I say, all cases are different, but we usually suggest that the adoptee and the birth mother develop or at least meet first and give them an opportunity, then bring in the significant others. Otherwise, it does get a little cloudy. And we have many adoptive parents who are very eager for their children, adult children, to find their birth family, especially, like I have an 80-year-old lady right now who feels more at all in she wants this all taken care of before she leaves. Or there was a case in one of the sessions yesterday where the child had some disabilities, and she really wanted to tie in to the birth mother. And it would be the ideal if all the adoptees and birth parents wanted these relationships. I had an adult adoptee in at one time, and he found out that he always had the fantasy that his birth parents were a great deal younger than his adoptive parents, for whom he was responsible and would be the rest of their lives. And he found out that his birth parents were as old, if not older, than the adoptive parents, and this just threw him for a loop, and said, I'm not sure that I can handle two sets of elderly people and be responsible for them. And of course, in the counseling part of it, you help them work this through, and to know that if they do establish some kind of relationship, set the boundaries and limits as to what they emotionally can handle. One adoptee right at the moment that I'm working with from a prison who's in there for murder, and he knew that his birth parents had some Indian heritage in them, and for some reason or other that was going to make his parole come up sooner. So it's some tie-in of some way. And his birth parents just really weren't all that eager to be, but felt very guilty about saying that because they did not want him to feel rejected again. And that there was a bond there, but there wasn't a bond there, that they had their own children and their own family, and then they had this other son, or it was a half-sib. The children were there. And of course, you've heard of other cases that are sensationalistic, in the media. And we all have stories like that, and fortunately I'm old enough now that all those things are going to disappear, and I won't write a book about it, and a lot of people are going to be happy because they don't want to read about themselves in a book. but you just hear all kinds of situations. I do believe strongly, though, that if you can get them to read Birth Bond, if you can get them to read Search and Aftermath, not only the birth parents, the adoptees, but the adoptive parents, if you can get them to see these videos, that these are the things that are important for them to see. Even in open adoption that we have seen in Texas, it does not stop at the placement and everybody knowing everybody else. It goes into the next stage where there is a whole new set of dynamics to deal with, and you have to help arbitrate on that. They may be able to do this on their own, which is great, but there may be a need for an arbitrator to help them work out some of these problems.
You know, what's interesting about your comments is that, you know, I mean, you're perceptive because you did leave a piece of your son there, and sometimes the way you look at things helps you have, you know, explore your feelings about them. You know, rather than looking at leaving a part of your son there as a loss for you, which it can also be, you know, what came to my mind was, you know, what a tremendous gift.
Yes.
Exactly. I mean,
Yes.
without their son, I wouldn't have more son.
No, the gift you gave.
That I give to them.
You gave
Well,
a gift there.
I
And that's
don't-
why you feel like you left a piece of your son.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it probably is
Yeah.
because I called them again in January before the war started, and I just felt I needed to talk to them and tell them that if anything happened to Kent, don't be afraid to contact us, because I felt that these people just, you know, if you don't have the education for open adoption, you're not going to know. And there's not a lot of people like my husband and I out there that are willing to do this. There's more and more.
Yes,
people
there-
who are helping
yes.
educate them.
Right,
And,
right.
when I called his stepmom, she said, you know, I was going to call you, and she says, because if anything happens,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
we want to have more contact with you. We might be bothering you. I said,
Yes.
you're not bothering me.
Yeah.
I said, I don't mind at all because,
You bond to them,
Yeah.
and you all are part of the same family. Yeah, absolutely. And the loss, you deal as most of us know, that if you have one loss, that can trigger another loss that comes along. It can compound it, and if those losses all get intermingled, you need to know what's going on. You need to recognize this. Otherwise, depression can really set in. And that a loss is a loss is a loss. It's like an adoptive parent who has had an infertility situation, whether there's been a miscarriage or no pregnancies at all. There's still the loss of the child that was not born. And that is as deep as any other loss. The Wedded Unmother is another good book. Excellent book. And though I'm not a member of the Triad, just having been in adoption as long as I have, I felt that I was not empathetic enough towards the adoptive parents and what they had been through. And I read that book and I sobbed through the book. It really is an excellent book for any professional in the field.
what's the title?
The Wedded Unmother.
The Wedded
If you want to put your name up here on this piece of paper, I'll send you all kinds of handouts and brochures that we do have. We have Dr. Brzezinski's Erickson's mode of the different developmental stages to talk with the children. We have a chart of the grief process among the triad and how it correlates with each other. We have the information from the University of Southern Maine on the typical crisis periods in adoption. We just have it, like I say, we're a resource center and there is no charge for it, and we're just more than happy. We send it out all over the United States and in Canada and Australia also.
I would like to know how you got the support group started for adoptive parents. The reason I ask that is sometimes we'll get calls in crisis, or they might come in once. But you know, to get the adoptive parents to come back in seems to be
It is very difficult.
Yeah.
All right, a little surreptitious. And for those of you adoptive parents in the group, please forgive me. But whenever I have a reluctant segment of Triad members, and I do this sincerely, I need to know more. I need to know more. I see what's going on. Would you please come join a group at my invitation? And because I honestly need to know what's going on. And they come. And once they come, then they're pretty much into the group
So you
process.
take on the need initially
Mm-hmm.
until they're ready to acknowledge that they have.
We have a little trouble also with the teenagers and the teenagers' parents. The teenagers' parents who think their children need to be in a support group, the kids aren't about to do it. And the teenagers who want to be in the support group, the parents say, don't open a can of worms, just let things go. And to try and coordinate those two things to get that group going is very difficult. And I think Catholic down in Houston has done an excellent job on that. They, again, put it on an educational basis, so it's non-threatening to everybody.
Could you tell me what you're doing for those families that are now the more recent generation of adoptive families with full disclosure, are cooperative or totally open adoptions? What kind of support
Right.
groups do you have for them?
Well, first of all, we have the birth mother support group because we have found that birth mothers who go through an open adoption do not necessarily have less of a grief process.
Oh.
And they think, oh, this is going to be easier because I'm going to have full contact, and of course it isn't, because they miss out on the stages. They don't miss out on the stages because of the open communication, but they are not raising the child. They are not the custodial parent. And I think that this is true in any family makeup where there's a custodial parent and a non-custodial parent. So what we do is really let them get together in their own group and vent, because they don't want to do anything to jeopardize the relationship that they have. And all I do is facilitate these groups. I mean, they tell each other how they feel about this. But that is the main thing, is to allow them a safe place. And we find this true in the children also, that even though they and their parents have talked about the wonderful adoption and open adoption and the birth parents and all, you really need to get the children in their own group to be able to talk about, well, I know that my birth parents know, or my birth mother knows my adoptive mother, and they get along great, but I'm a little uneasy about this or that. And they're not going to say that in front of either the birth mother or the adoptive mother. So I think that the groups, the peer groups, really give them a safe place to talk about this and vent and get it out of their systems, and then they go back to the situation and it's not the big to-do that it was before.
From a resource point of view, what's the one or two greatest lacking resources that either you or other people might see for adopted adolescents and people in the triad, both, I mean, the adopted adolescents, the adopted parent, and also the birth, are in that area, what are resources that need to be developed that
Okay.
aren't there?
Just recently in Texas, we had quite a lawsuit, the Department of Human Services, with adoptive parents who said that they were not told the background completely of the older children they adopted. So Texas has set up this new law that any child that was under the custody of DHS at one time, that they have to offer ongoing counseling, respite care, residential psychiatric treatment care, and so on and so forth. Now, for the infants that were adopted through private agencies or privately, they would not have that, and it's exactly why some of our centers are set up. But once again, I would say, prepare the people before the adolescents have these problems. If you can make the child comfortable in the concrete stages of Erickson and Brzezinski, if you can make the child comfortable with the parent comfortable with the term of adoption when concreteness has set in the first stage, so that they can at least talk about it with getting tears in their eyes, then you go on to the latency age where they know to have been released or to have been chosen is to have been released, and when they're aware that there's one of the fears that we have with the latency age child is the birth parent's going to come back and take them.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
To dispel through the birth parent, to let them know that the legal system is such and such. They don't understand the legal system until they get older, closer to the adolescent stage. But if you build upon this foundation where you first made them comfortable with the terminology of adoption and talking about it and open communication, so it's not a codependent family, don't talk, don't trust, and then go on into the latency age and let the child deal with some of the real fears or feeling of abandonment that they might have at that stage, they won't talk with their parents about it at that period unless the birth parent is actually in on the situation, and it will be in an open adoption. You shouldn't have all that much when you get to the adolescent stage. A lot of the acting out and problems in adolescence now with the adoptees is the fact that those other stages were not taken care of. And it's like any good mental health therapy of any kind. It's like a grief process. If you get stuck in one stage, you're going to stay there. You're not going to move on until you get that taken care of. And you can do that with children. But you have to build on it. You can't just suddenly wait and do everything and let's sit down and talk about this type thing. So there's self-esteem, and Lois Molina, and she should really give us some credit for this, because her adopted child, you're familiar with her newsletter, talks about self-esteem in the adoptive children and how to build on it. And you don't start when they're adolescents. It's too late. They're so involved in their psychosexual stages in adolescence that you need to do these things during latency age when they're not threatened. You can talk about sex with latency age children. You can talk about sex with your toddlers, school age, because if you have one placement in a family and the first child is 3-4 years old when the second placement comes along, they have rudimentary ideas about sex even at that early age. You know, mommy's tummy isn't getting fat like the ladies next door, and yet we're going to have a baby. These kids are smart. These kids know what in the heck they're doing. So you can start building at a very early age and on their self-esteem. Do role-playing with them on what to say to children when they are on the school ground and they say, your mother gave you away, your real mother. And build upon these things so that they can handle it. There should be a lot less adolescent. What is it now, 40% of the psychiatric residential treatment centers? Some are even just purely for adoptees. The statistics are way out of line for adoptive kiddos. And I'm not talking just about older adopted children, that have been adopted at an older age. We're talking about infants that were adopted. We truly believe that that won't come around. However, if you need a tool in adolescence, it's your peer group. And that's the best way to get to them.
We've had a surge of calls lately from kids that are partial Asian, like whether it be Vietnamese or Korean or whatever.
Yes, we had, it wasn't too successful, but we had one group and with the parents, and the parents don't want to get in on this because they say they're colorblind. The parents are colorblind, and the interracial does not bother them. COAC feels very much that way, and I admire them for what they do. But the child is not colorblind, nor is this. That's right, nor are their peers. So there's a lot of work to be done with these kiddos. And we had one little girl who was Korean that was in our group, and her mother, who was a single parent, was a very statuesque blonde professional lady, and we had the kiddos draw pictures of themselves. We use a lot of projective techniques in our work, and she drew this beautiful, tall, blonde lady, and we very gently confronted her about this, and she got very angry and said, this is what I want to be like, and I hate the way I am. I hate how I look. And yet her mother had been very diligent in exposing her to Korean things, history, and just was even thinking of going over there and showing her the culture, because she could not find her birth mother or her birth family to introduce her to. So these are very difficult things to do. We have quite a few of the children that are black-white coming in to us on crisis intervention with the Anglo parents, and the jury's still out on that. You can find studies that say they have better self-esteem, and you can find some studies that say that not so. So I think, the jury is still out, and you just have to handle those individually. Not being able to find homes for them, is that a good enough reason to go ahead and do this? I don't know. Yes, Sue?
What kind of population base do you think you need, and what kind of community education do you need to do to get enough people to get groups like you're talking about going?
Going. Well, we've been very fortunate. Texas Cradle sold their maternity home. They no longer had a need for it. And the board of directors said, what can we do to help adoption? And it was decided that the best way they could do this was to offer post-adopt services. So we had a financial basis. So this has been a pilot program for at least 5 years, and it's been going on for 3 years. We've opened up 650 cases. And when you talk about probably dealing with at least 2 or 3 of the members of the triad in each case, you're talking about a significant number of people that are being served. Some of the counseling is done on a sliding scale basis. The support groups, like I say, are free. We advertise about them. We put in the newspapers. We have them on the radios. But we have found that the yellow pages and word of mouth seem to be our best way. Is that the same with you? We do a lot of networking. In fact, Carol and I were in on developing the first post-adopt professional group in Texas. And we did it because we were all isolated out there in our own little area, and we put out the word and say, hey, is there anybody else out there dealing with some of the problems we're dealing with? And we got together, and this will be the fifth year that we've gotten together to brainstorm. And we just network and brainstorm because we know that that's the only way we can continue to learn on this. But money is a problem. Now, there are some states, there was only one up until recently, there are some states that require this by law. And there is one state that requires it by law at no fee. Isn't Wisconsin? New Jersey put in post-adopt services because they found that they had so many people incarcerated and in residential psychiatric treatment centers who were adopted. They said, whoa, we're spending a lot of money on these people. There has to be a better way. And fortunately, they realized that the better way was to have post-adopt services and a lot of education prior. And that's what Dr. David Brzezinski got in on out there at Rutgers. He was in from the beginning.
The group that I'm in with, they've always had a birth mother support group from the time that they began, or at least for the last couple of years anyway, that I know of. When I came on board, because there's only 3 of us, we're very small, we started a adoptive parent support group. The first night I had 8 people, the next night I had 18 people.
Oh, great.
And this, I've only been doing this for 3 months.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelming, the people that want to come and talk and share. And most of them they're in different ranges of the adoption. You know, a lot of them are looking for babies, but we're educating them on how to do that.
On the lifelong process. And better up front than afterwards when the problems exist. You just have, that's great. What state are you in?
California.
California, that's great. It is a financial problem, there's no doubt about it.
We're a very small non-profit organization. There's only 3 of us, and sometimes we get paid, sometimes we don't. Our services are free to our birth mom.
Yeah. We have found that there's a difference between the ALMA group and the group that we have at the center. And we coordinate things together because some of the same people go to each group. But we are not a search group. We are definitely feelings and emotions that we talk about. Now, after they leave or while they have a cup of coffee, you know, they can do whatever they want. And like I say, we do pass out a search packet, but for those who want to do their own. But we are feelings and emotions. We're not a search group, so we don't compete with anybody, and I think that's wise because there's been enough competition in adoption already without getting into that.
How are you funded? Do the clients, whatever you choose to call them, do they pay a fee, or is it all funded by?
Well, because we had these funds that the board set up because of the sale of the maternity home, we are funded for the 5 years. However, because we found such a tremendous response in the community, people come from Austin, some come from Dallas and Houston. They have reasons because that's where it was consummated. It seems to be of enough interest that as a nonprofit agency on a sliding scale, we'll probably be able to maintain our services, hopefully. And I think our board will always be helping in some or United Way We've looked at United Way also because this seems to be a real need. We have, well, how many? We have something like 22, 25 agencies, adoption agencies in San Antonio. Isn't that terrible?
That many?
Isn't that terrible?
What is the population of San Antonio?
About 1 million. About 1 million.
An awful lot. Are those public agencies or companies?
These are licensed. These are licensed agencies.
Really?
These are licensed agencies. And I'm... If you're licensed, I certainly hope that you wouldn't be.
Oh, in Colorado, either for-profit or not-for-profit
Right.
agencies can be licensed.
Yes, well, we can too in Texas, technically. Yeah. What we would hope is that those of us that come from the old, stodgy agencies of the years past that are dealing with some of the mistakes that we made in the past will impart what we have learned on the new agencies. But some of the older, stodgy agencies say, no way are we going to do that. And some of the newer agencies will say, hey, that's not important to us. We don't need post-adopt. We've only been in business for 5 years. We don't have anything along those lines. So there's still a lot of things to be ironed out on that. Really are. Yeah. This gentleman, I think, had his hand up.
Well, when you brought up the illustration about the Korean daughter,
Mm-hmm.
it brings to, I'm an adopted parent, and our children were told right from the beginning, so that there wasn't any secrets.
That they were adopted or that
They were
transracial?
They were adoptive children.
All right.
Adopted, and we got them when they were 3 days old, so it was like having them
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning. I found the problem we had with one daughter wasn't because she was adopted, it was because we're all fairly slim, and she was big boned, and so she didn't feel like she was part of the family. And so her self-esteem had nothing to do with being adopted.
With adopted.
It was with her physical appearance.
Right, right.
And what was interesting about this, she's about 33 now. We encouraged her to do a search, which she did. And she found her 3 half-brothers were built just like she was.
Uh-huh.
So it made her feel better,
Yeah.
realizing that there was some identification that, this was part of the part of her birth
Gave her a
family,
comfort level.
And
Mhm.
her birth mother was also a big bone person.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, when she went to search for her, and I had some qualms about it, not so much from her learning about it, was that I said, you want to be prepared that perhaps this mother may reject you because she went through a traumatic experience.
Sure.
It turned out
Most
she did
protective
reject
parents
her.
do that.
She didn't want to see her.
Mhm.
And so she never did see her.
Mhm.
But her half-brothers, actually are the greatest people, and it's really given her a lot of confidence.
Yes.
now.
Often when we find denial on the birth mother's part who allows the sibs to get together, that she is just very fearful that that the adoptee will hold some anger towards her, or it has been such a traumatic experience for herself that she has not been able to deal with it. However, we've also found that when the sibs get together, that eventually it works in to an acceptance on the part. So you never say never in these cases, because it can always come up at a later time. What I hear from you is what I hear from most of the adoptive parents, is that they want to protect their children from being hurt. And children, they're adults. And even children have to fall and skin their knees and get up and dust themselves off and learn how to take care of themselves for life later on. Otherwise, they won't be prepared for the way it is. But we do protect as parents, there's no doubt about it, and I think especially in adoption because of the unknowns. However, I've also seen that on the birth parent side, and I'm dealing right at the moment with 14 schizophrenics, 2 murderers, and untold numbers of substance abusers on all sides of the triad. On all sides of the triad. And you would think in protection, and I even get hung up in that mode because those of us in the profession have been rather controlling in the years past, and we're trying not to be now, to protect these people so they won't be hurt. But then you realize these are consenting adults, and they have to do their own thing, and they have to get hurt sometimes. They have to experience this. These are things that are brought up in the counseling in order to prepare everybody for this. And I think that is so important to do. There's such a thing as sexual genetic attraction, and there's going to be a general session on that, and I think anyone who gets into reunions need to know about that. There are many dynamics that you need to know about, either through reading or counseling or something such as that. Even when it's been a negative situation, I have reporters who will say, well, how many good ones and how many bad ones have you had? And you'll say, hey, there is no such thing. You know, there are good points and bad points to everything. And you're talking about suppressed feelings and a lot of sense of loss. So yes, it's going to be emphasized even more in these relationships, but it can be dealt with. I've had quite a few adoptees accept money from their birth parents shortly after the reunion, just to test them to see whether or not they would say yes or no. And that's when you check out boundaries and parameters to relationships. And you say to the birth parent, gosh, you know, why'd you do that? And you say, well, I just couldn't say no. So these are things that happen and that you have to help them work through, and the peer groups help tremendously. Tremendously.
I'm a social worker, and we have a small adoption support group for parents, and we've only been in the adoption business, maybe Catholic Social Ministries.
Where?
Fayette, North Carolina.
Okay.
And we were 2 dioceses, and most of the adoption, in one diocese, most of the adoption was done in the other diocese initially.
Uh-huh.
But we have some, like 6, 7, 8-year-olds that I'm thinking are ready for some kind of a support group on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been looking for materials to use.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you
Well,
know, lots of for adolescents, but that
okay.
age group.
Let me send Brzezinski's work to you, and he does have a new book out because it will be very helpful to you. Dirk Brown's book is Susan or whatever.
I was just going to say, would you like to start passing that around?
Sure.
Sign up rather than having everybody.
Sure.
Just send on the last minute?
This is a newsletter that we send out. We have found that a lot of the mental health professionals in our area will not come to seminars that we have because your psychiatrists and psychologists will not come to a master's level person, and we got very frustrated. We'd bring these high-powered speakers in and nobody would come. So we thought, well, we'll just send out a newsletter whether they want it or not. And we surreptitiously got the mailing list for the psychiatrists. And of course, I belong to the APA. And we send out 1,200 issues of our newsletters that are written for the mental health professional on their level. And it's amazing the reaction that we've gotten from this. And we feel it's been well worth our expense in doing it. And if you would like to be as professionals. Actually, we've had members of the Triad ask us to add them to the list also, even if they're not in the field. So if you're interested in that, I do have a few cards of our groups here, but if you'd like to be on the mailing list, and then you can keep the card or whatever.
I have a question. When you talk about good adoptee versus bad adoptee, and the statistics of adoptees being in residential treatment centers, what is the percentage of males versus females? Well, let's do one question at a time. Good adoptees versus bad adoptees. Do you have any statistics as far as, are girls more likely to be the good adoptees than the bad adoptees? Or is it about even?
It's about even. However, prior to children running away and going out in the streets, there were more male adoptees. Now that it's being accepted for the females also to run away and go on the streets, it's becoming fairly even. We have had the percentages in the psychiatric treatment centers to be as high as 40%. And of those, they are primarily the girls. The boys start acting out in such a way that they get into some other systems. They're more likely to get into the law enforcement system of some kind. But it can be either. It can be either. I think one of the saddest things as far as the men are concerned, I don't see the male adoptees. Of the 600 cases that I have right now, 3/4 of them are adoptees. And the other 1/4 is a combination of birth parents and adoptive parents. But of the adoptees, 3/4 of them are females, and 3/4 of them have asked us not to let their adoptive parents know that they're there.
One question that I have, I'm a graduate student going for my master's, and I had been to a talk on women in addiction, And adoption is, of course, my issue, my interest. And then I was reading some information, that packet, that educational packet from Burko Publishing, by the way.
Yes.
Which I picked up last year, which really helped me.
Good.
And my question is that, are there really any statistics or like an intake form, so now that substance abuse has become such a problem in our society? I'm wondering if adoptees would not be a good percentage of that population, given the statistics as far as a large percentage of the population being in residential treatment.
Yes, I certainly have had a lot of adoptees who are in halfway houses for substance abuse call and say, please have them look up my background. I'm sure my birth parents were into substance abuse because I am, and I know I inherited it. And I said, well, we'll be glad to find that out for you, but quite frankly, that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. The alcoholism is important to know, but then they can stay away from it. But if they're in a home, an adoptive home with a great deal of alcoholism, that's pretty much as being raised with alcoholics, and you fairly well stay away from that, especially if you think that your birth parents have not been abusers. You feel like you have the genetic ability not to do what your environment has. I will say one thing. As long as I've been in post-adopt, I am a strong believer in genetic tie-in. There are things, folks, that we are not aware of, even in the Minnesota Twin studies about inheritance. It is wild sometimes, the comparisons that you get into.
I was going to mention, I've worked with Search Institute. It's not a search agency, but it's a research organization. Tomorrow, workshop 65, we're doing a nationwide study. And there's some of that data that we're looking at specifically as part of the adoption dynamics. I'm not the expert on that, but Dr. Anu Sharma will be here tomorrow.
Good. Part of that interest is personal because I'm an adoptee, and I've started to search, and I have a son who's 20, and he has a problem with substance abuse. And I know, of course, his side of the family is father. His father abuses, but I don't, and my family doesn't. So there is that question. If my son did, I mean, what would the likelihood be about that missing link on my side of the family?
Right.
Not to say that it takes both sides of the family. So that's
of course, we all have missing links in one way or another, and none of us know everything about, even if we go to family reunions every year, none of us know. I had a young man who had his court records open, and he came in, and we found out that both of his birth parents were deceased of drug overdoses. And he said, if I had only known this previously, because he had gotten into drugs rather heavily himself, he said, if I had only known this earlier, or my adoptive parents had known this earlier, maybe I could have stayed away from it. So these things are very important to know. Very important to know.
I think it's a good bit of information to know that if you have alcoholism on both sides of your family, your children are like 4 times as likely to become alcoholics.
There are good statistics out on these things now.
It's just like I know like stats for schizophrenia and like the mental illness and so forth.
In schizophrenia, it's 13% for one parent and 50% for the two. Usually, the best place to get these statistics is if you have a health science center in your area. But I also get the Harvard Medical School mental health letter, and they give out those statistics quite often and very update. So that's a good paper to get into too.
I had talked to the guy that did the survey, and the first year I met him, he was presenting at one of these workshops, and he said, there are some things that they're just coincidence. That 2 women would be raised apart and wear a ton of rings. Really coincidence. And the next year, he had found so much more that he said, scientifically we can't say what it is. It's like outside the scientific realm.
Yeah, listen, we really need to look into this. I've had a birth mother and adult adoptee after reunion find out they had the very same picture over their beds, and it would be a way out picture that you wouldn't necessarily have, and I'm sure you could tell tales like that too. And had one birth mother and one adoptee, and all their excitement during the honeymoon talked about that one had trashed a house at 11, and it was the very age, and they even went about it in the very same way. I said, now come on, that can't be inherited. That's ridiculous, that type of thing. And you're talking about 2 sets of genetic backgrounds. Dr. Horn out at the University of Texas at Austin is in a lot of the literature that's being given out here, and he and I had a to-do once because he left out the genetic side of the birth father completely, and all of his studies are done with the birth mother and the adoptive parents, which is okay as long as experimental design is set up to realize that that's part of it.
You could say, well, there's not a chromosome for trashing a house.
That's right. That's right. You know?
There may be
never
a need
know.
for that.
Coincidental.
When you talked about the one child doing a drawing,
Uh-huh.
do you do any kind of type of those techniques in your adoptee or birth parent groups?
The only thing that we've done with the birth parent group is with our artists, and if you've looked at the exhibit out here, it's very good. The birth mothers that are in our groups who were artists, it was amazing the difference in their art before and after. It just tugs at your heartstrings. I have some of it up in my office, and it's just amazing. I would imagine it'd be true with the adoptive parents also, as far as their interest. You go into a home prior to adoption of a child, and they have a cacti garden in the background, and you go back later, you see such thing. Or, the dogs are on satin pillows when you go in the first time. When you go back, they're relegated to the outside world. But it has to. All these things have to affect people in some way. But there is a happy medium. And when I was up in Colorado not long ago at a reality therapy conference, they really took me to task on this and said, now, you're saying adoption is a panacea for all problems. I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you need to, any good therapist rules out the physical before they get to the psychological if you go to a doctor, right? Well, what's wrong with ruling out the dynamics of adoption before looking into whatever else is the problem? Because it's somewhat easy to rule out the issues. For instance, yesterday when I heard about the birth mothers having felt like they overwhelmed the adoptees as they came through, one of the questions I asked, or I prepared the adult adoptee for before they had the reunion, is, would you ever release a child for adoption? And if they just fly through the ceiling and say, no way would I ever release a child for adoption, you know that you need to work with them a little bit in preparation on releasing their anger before they get into the relationship and understanding what the birth mother went through and what the times were like. That's one of the assets I have in being an old-timer. I remember what it was like then. They had no options and the stigma and everything. And you try to explain this and set the scene for them. There's a lot of work that can be done. A lot of work. You can't cover all bases, You can't be complete on any of this, but you can do the best you can. And I network with people all over the United States, and I gladly give them my list of preparational questions that I deal with on that. One of the first things is best scenario, worst scenario. And you can learn a lot from the client on that because you know what attitude they're coming from. I was telling them, the one I asked was, would you ever release a child for adoption? Mm-hmm. And you find out real quickly if there's any, with the men never come through the door until they're dragged in by their wives. That I'm not interested, but my wife is because of the kids. But you get him into the individual session and you start talking about the birth mother. And you talk about the possible SIBs. And men are human. Men are human. They've just been taught to be different. Any other questions or comments that you would like to add to it? Get an early start to go? Well, if you would like, we gladly will share anything that we have, and if there's anything that you would like to share with us, we would gladly receive it.
I'm a potential adoptive parent. We've got a resume going out now, and I'm also, I have a master's degree and I'm in an internship for an MFCC here in California. And so I look at it from more than one aspect. And it's also interesting to me to listen to things and hear how much I don't know about the politics of what's going on and about the history of what's going on. And yet how you both mention how much the dynamics are similar when you get down to nitty-gritty dynamics as in lots of different kinds of counseling that we do. But I really appreciated when you got to use role-playing, use this technique, use that technique. I think that's really helpful when you mention specific techniques that seem to work with specific groups.
Interventions. I think, however, still again, your peer support group is the best technique, and it really is. However, I've used Gestalt for anger, and that helps some. The projected techniques we usually do use mainly with the kids.
children.
Yeah. And, oh wow,
It's even
they're
fun to have
revealing.
them draw, you know, their
So
family, how they
revealing.
see their adoptive family. I mean, we had a kid draw the whole family in the house, and he was out in the yard.
But I wonder about when you mentioned at the end about the adult, when you're talking about adult adoptees, I'm married to an adult adoptee.
Oh.
And how much could you use, because of the conflict that they have perhaps not finished yet, and they may be stuck at certain developmental ages, how much have you used that, used projective work with them, use some of the techniques that you would use with younger children on adults because of their emotional developmental stage?
Just because of time limitations, I no longer use Rorschach or TAT or any of the old-timey ones that I used to use with the adults because it's just so time-consuming.
That's true.
But I think just the one-on-one and dealing with them, and once again, I think it's really good to get somebody who's been in the field for a while, because I had a TV cameraman who I noticed who kept getting closer and closer to me, and he said, you know, all this bit about birth mothers still remembering their children. He said, hey, I don't believe what you say. I'm a bastard, and I know I'm a bastard. And I took him aside, and we talked a little bit more, and I told him, you know, how I remembered all this subterfuge we used to go through to keep it quiet and to hush it up and whatnot. And his eyes were like this because, you know, that's not the lifestyle he has now. He just he can't imagine giving away flesh and blood. And, you know, you can keep a child now. Sometimes even your younger kids will do that and say, well, why didn't somebody give her the money to help, you
Simple
know?
as that.
Yeah, why didn't somebody help her to do this? So it kind of depends upon the different stages, but with the adults, the one-on-one and some videos, that Right to Know video is excellent. And it's only $19.
And they move quite quickly is what you're saying.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes they do. And I think that this is important for them to do before they adopt.
Good overview, lady.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sure.
This concludes this session